Did that always been the case that like before you go into making a record, you're like, this is the vibe and this is what it's about? Or is this something that's developed more recently where you're like, I want to make a body of work that has a theme?
You know what? It usually happens about halfway through. So I reckon it takes me about 12 months to put a record together. 12 to 18 months. And so probably the first half of that period, I'm literally just messing around with ideas and jamming and recording these really long jam sessions of me on synths and just literally messing about. But because our life is our life. And so even when you're just messing about, there's something in that you're going to do that is a reflection of what your life is like at that time. Through that process, I find that I kind of hone it down. I'm like, oh, well, I'm tending to do things that are a bit like that. And so what does that mean? And how can you like hone in on that and make it more about that? So I've never yet started literally started from scratch going, oh, this is going to be about this. But it usually becomes apparent pretty quick over a period of time where I'm making a record that, oh, this is what this is going to end up being like and being about. And I'd love to make that. I'd love to get to that point sooner, because I feel like all the time before that, you're just kind of flailing about aimlessly. And then as soon as you've got a concept, in a sense, it becomes way easier, because then all of these little micro decisions that you're making about, I don't know, what's that bass sound like, or how do I EQ that? It's like, well, does it feel like that? Or does it not feel like that? And if it feels like that, then you're in the right direction. If it doesn't, then you're not, and you do something else. So I feel like I tend to have all these sort of visual pictures in my mind, and if I've got a visual sort of concept of what a track is about or what an album's about, I can just kind of visualize that picture, and then everything goes like 20 times faster, because suddenly all these little micro choices are kind of made for you, and you end up not procrastinating about, like, delay effects and all this kind of stuff, because it's just like, oh, well, is it that? No, okay, well, it's, you move on. So yeah, I'd like it to be that conceptual phase happens sooner than it does, but yeah, it just seems to kind of morph gradually into that.
Well, it's interesting that you're still talking about like hitting a clear point where you understand what it is. There's like that old kind of quote, it's something like, the map making itself brings forth the features of the terrain. And then do you find that there's like a real like clear aha moment, or is it a little bit more gradual? And then when you kind of realize what it is, do you sit down and write a manifesto, or do you have a process of really like defining what that picture is?
For the stuff that I've done so far, it's always been pretty quick. Like the tipping point from having no concept to having a reasonably formed concept, for me, seems to be pretty quick. I just wish it would happen sooner. But you go through this period of just basically messing about, and then for me it's usually a combination of like a couple of books that I've read, or some ideas that people are talking about, or in this case just the idea of being able to get out for a walk and how massively important that is, where we're at the moment. And then it's like, oh, that's what this is. And then I don't tend to write down a manifesto, but I think about it a lot. I spend a lot of time, usually when I can't sleep, just like processing the ideas in my head and coming up with pictures, really, like some kind of picture storyboard in my mind of what this thing is. And
are we talking
I like,
do you literally see images in your mind? Or is it kind of more of like a multi-sensory feeling, quasi-emotional?
No,
space?
it's quite imagery based, actually. Like I remember, and actually, so that like the record I put out before this one was very much kind of influenced by extinction and the way that species go extinct all the time, and the fact that not so long ago people didn't really understand that there was even a concept of extinction. And I had all these pictures of basically like this sort of dystopian landscape that were really well formed in my mind but and never outside of my mind. And then it's that kind of weird thing where you're mixing a track and you're sort of placing all your instruments within that landscape and seeing if they make sense or not. And so with this one, it was like the same idea, but the completely opposite concept, where like that the photograph that's on the cover was taken by a really good friend of mine who lives quite near me, and I was talking to him about artwork, and he showed me a bunch of photographs that he'd taken, and this particular one I was kind of like, that's like surprisingly close to this sort of sonic landscape picture that I've got in my mind. So that's the artwork. Thank you very much. Brilliant. And yeah, so I think they're usually pretty well formed images. And I find it really useful. I don't remember where I read this now, but I was reading some article about it might have been a Nigel Godrich interview, I can't remember, but he was talking about when he's mixing a band and he's basically like imagining all these little miniature figures sitting on the meter bridge of the console, and you're kind of like, oh yeah, that's where the guitar is. And so in a sort of simplistic sense, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to pan that over here and pan that over here, but you also get this like sense of, it helps you paint that like three-dimensional space, and so particularly on that track Kalimba, in my mind I kind of imagine that as this like that bass line thing is kind of like this old dude with like a sort of homemade string bass thing. Like the one string bass thing?
Yeah.
And he's sort of sitting on the beach and just doing this sort of meditative thing. And
yeah.
And it's trying to place all those sounds in that landscape in a way that kind of hopefully makes sense.
Amazing. What really struck me with that is it's almost like you're able to give yourself like a brief. And for everyone who's like wondering how can Matt like just crank out tracks like this so quickly and so beautifully, I think, can we talk a little bit about, your day job, or one of your many day jobs, and the fact that you have spent a huge amount of time doing music for picture, music for media, so you really understand, like, does this fit the brief for this project? And you must have like that instinct, whether you've consciously acknowledged it or not, must be very strong in you.
I think I have totally consciously acknowledged it. And in a sense, I wish I'd acknowledged it more consciously a long time ago. Because I fought against this idea for such a long time that I guess like this utopic idea of the freedom to create anything, which is a beautiful idea. But for me, unless I've got some pretty strong boundaries in place, I literally just won't finish anything ever. And so when I started, I guess like probably my first sort of proper job in the music industry was writing music for TV commercials, and I did a lot of them, which isn't to say that I actually got a lot of them, because the first rule of TV commercials is that you have to like pitch on about between 50 and 100 to get one. So you're constantly churning out a lot of material really quickly. And I guess through that process, I'd find myself going, yeah, but this guitar part really wants to go like this, and it just musically that makes sense, and that like that term in my head, musically that makes sense. And I find myself very seldom now going musically that makes sense, because musically seems to be one of the sort of less important parts of it, which sounds like a ludicrous thing to say, but it's like there's all. I guess I should caveat that by saying that I think I've been trying to break out of my reasonably formal music education since I stopped being in formal music education. And so I guess like throughout my teenage years, and I went to university and studied music, there was a lot of this kind of stuff where it's like, this is how this system works, and if you're writing music like this, it has to go like this, and these are the rules, and blah 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 blah. And it took, and I'm still kind of breaking out of that, but particularly when you try and enforce those like music rules in the wider field of creating output for things like TV and particularly film, where like the music is definitely not the most important thing. Like, it's a service industry, right? You're making music to make the whole concept of the project bigger and better than it is. And so you've got to serve that like bigger medium. and it used to really irk me, and I'd be really frustrated because I'm like, well, this isn't writing music, this is just like making a thing for this thing, but they're all the same thing. And so like within my own projects, I've like totally sort of paradoxically, I'm now like, oh, what I need is a brief, and I need some boundaries to set myself. And then suddenly you find yourself like outputting a ton of material. Well, not a ton, but
well, it's just what you were saying about like the decision then becomes easy.
Yeah,
right.
Totally.
And I think like it's such a challenge sometimes when you don't have those boundaries or understand what you're making, because you have an infinity of possibilities in all directions. And then personally, I just tend to pivot 360 degrees looking around and not moving in any direction.
Totally.
So
totally.
I just think this is such an interesting point, Matt, because it's like you're saying, you're kind of making a bit of a joke that creativity should be free, but in many ways it feels like the creative aspect that you've really unlocked is like it's on a higher dimension now, ultimately. Like, but seriously, it's like you're making music, you're exploring, and then you uncover like a larger truth to communicate, or a larger concept to communicate, or a larger feeling to communicate, or you understand what that body of work is meant to be about, and that then informs what the music is supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully.